A creaking hinge, not from disrepair, but from age, marked the turning of the weather vane. The metal rooster shifted slightly north for the first time in months. The village below didn't notice, but one boy looked up. There is a quiet significance in things that move slowly, especially when they are not meant to move often. The weather vane, perched high above the village like an old sentinel, had been still for what felt like forever. It wasn't rusted in place, nor forgotten. It had simply not been needed to turn. The wind had not changed in months, and so it had remained, its iron rooster facing eastward like a guardian with a fixed gaze. This stillness was not something anyone spoke of, but if they had, they might have admitted it felt strange, or perhaps comforting. Predictable, like the ringing of the bell that no longer rang or the worn path by the well that was never quite overgrown. The hinge, ancient and stubborn in its loyalty, creaked not out of neglect but because it had remembered too many seasons. It had turned through the years like a joint that knew what to do, even when the body no longer asked for motion. The sound it made was not abrupt. It was slow and uncertain, a kind of shy declaration that change had come. Just a little, just enough. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a creak, one that knew how to carry weight in silence. And above the village, this sound echoed into nothing. No one was waiting for it. No one expected it. The sky did not shift hue. The clouds didn't scatter like startled sheep. Nothing called attention to the moment but the moment itself. The rooster, crafted in another century, perhaps by a blacksmith who took pride in small things, rotated a few degrees northward, as if remembering where it had once pointed, or being reminded of where it had always meant to look. The villagers below were as they always were. Someone beat a rug at the back of a house. Someone else stirred stew with the end of a wooden spoon smoothed down by decades. A child dropped a doll. A dog barked, but not urgently. The world kept its rhythm, its pattern of unnoticed repetitions. The kind of repetitions that feel invisible while lived, but gather weight in memory. And yet, among them all, one boy looked up. Why he looked up, no one could say. Perhaps it was because the wind touched his cheek just a little differently. Or perhaps he had always been the sort to look at things no one else thought to notice. He was not remarkable in the usual ways. He wasn't taller than the others or cleverer or louder. But he watched things, leaves, shadows, cracks in stone. He once told someone he could tell when it was going to rain just by the way the sparrows flew lower. He wasn't right every time, but often enough that it felt like he was listening to something others couldn't hear. So when he looked up and saw the weather vane shift, he didn't shout or point. He didn't run home or draw a map. He just noticed. That was all. And for a moment, in the quiet of the turning metal, in the sigh of a breeze that hadn't visited in months, it felt like noticing was enough. There is a kind of sacredness in such moments. The world, which so often demands loudness, here offered something small and easily missed. And to notice such a thing, to truly bear witness to it, was not nothing. The boy might not have known the history of the weather vane, nor the story of the blacksmith who forged it, nor the exact year the hinge was oiled last. But he saw it, and that meant the moment did not pass unseen. Because change, when it comes like this, quiet, slow, modest, rarely announces itself. It's not the thunderclap or the landslide. It's the creak of a hinge, the tilt of a rooster. The breath of wind no longer came from the same place. Perhaps the weather vane had once mattered more. Perhaps once, a villager had climbed the tower steps daily just to check its direction. Perhaps decisions had been made based on its angle. When to plant, when to travel, when to stay indoors and wait. But the tower had aged, and the need for such watchfulness had faded or been replaced by other things. The tower still stood barely, but few looked up anymore. Still, the rooster turned, as if to say, the world still moves, even when you stop watching. And the hinge, whose slow voice sang just once a day, had waited patiently for its time. Its creak was not a complaint, nor a warning. It was a reminder that age carries memory, and movement, even the smallest, means the story is not done. The boy who looked up didn't tell anyone what he'd seen, not because it was a secret, but because he didn't need to. Some things stay truer when kept inside. He walked home, thinking about the sound the hinge had made. He tried to mimic it in his head, not squeaky like a broken gate, not shrill, just old, like the first note of a song played on an instrument left too long untouched. He thought about how the rooster didn't look different from down below, but he knew it had turned. And he thought about how the wind had come from the north, even though it hadn't in so long. Maybe tomorrow it would come again, or maybe not, but it had come once, and sometimes that's what begins the shift. One breath of change, one unremarkable creep, one boy who looks up. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic changed in the village. No great storms, no sudden arrivals, but some said the bread baked differently, a little lighter. Others thought the air in the morning felt crisper, the kind of changes you'd need yours to prove if you were even trying to. But most weren't. They were too busy living. The Weathervane, now facing slightly north, stayed that way. Maybe it would turn again in time, maybe not, but the fact that it had turned once lingered in the tower, in the metal, and in the boy's memory, and that was enough to make the old hinge wait patiently for its next chance to speak. Some moments come to pass quietly. They do not interrupt. They do not demand to be recorded or remembered. They pass like shadows at dusk, soft, long, and easy to overlook. But in their gentleness, they shape everything. They are not the chapters of the story, but the pause between sentences. They are not the song, but the breath before the note. They are what gives meaning to stillness, not as an absence, but as a kind of presence all its own. The boy would grow older, as all boys do. He would leave the village for a time, or maybe not. He would forget the names of some people and remember the shape of certain clouds. But the moment the Weathervane creaked and turned, he would keep that. Maybe not the exact date, maybe not the reason, but the feeling that something quiet had happened, and he had noticed. And that, in the end, is how most things are carried forward, not by record or retelling, but by remembrance that lives not in words, but in awareness. A hinge that creaks because it remembers. A rooster that turns not to be seen, but because the wind says so. A boy who looks up simply because something inside him says, now. It is in such moments that the world reveals its softer truths. That time does not always march, but sometimes lingers. That even the metal things can have memory, and that change, when it comes slowly, is no less real for its quietness. So the Weathervane remains, high above, turning only when the wind truly insists, and below it, life continues unhurried, half aware, and still. But somewhere in that stillness, a boy once looked up, and that looking up, even if no one else ever did, made all the difference. There are places where time does not pass in the same way it does elsewhere. The house beneath the vane was one of those places. To an outsider, it might have appeared ordinary, perhaps even unremarkable. A house like many others, shutters aged by weather, paint curling from the wood like dried petals, roof tiles holding their posture but no longer tight in their purpose. And yet, despite the slow encroachment of age and season, it remained unaltered in a quiet, almost dignified way. The vane itself, perched atop the gable like a sentinel, still turned in the wind. It did not creak or cry out. It merely rotated in solemn rhythm, acknowledging the currents that passed over this unmoved dwelling. Its motion was the only concession to change the house allowed. Everything beneath it, everything sheltered by its watch, held steady. The shutter stayed drawn halfway, never fully closing. Never entirely open, perhaps a metaphor for the people within. These shutters were like eyelids, neither sleeping nor waking. Half measures that suggested alertness without commitment. From the outside, this halfway gesture seemed both inviting and resistant, a glimpse in, but never an opening. Not quite a welcome, not quite a wall. The door's paint had once been a richer color, though now it stood as a memory of itself, peeling just slightly, not enough to require urgent care, not enough to offend the senses, but enough to whisper stories of what it once looked like. The kind of decline that goes unnoticed over days, but shocks you if you compare photographs from decades apart. That is how decline often works, not in sudden ruin, but in slow surrender. Still, The people inside did not repaint it. They did not oil the hinges or pull the shutters all the way up. They did not replace the warped slats or chase the cobwebs from the corners. They lived beside these changes, not in opposition to them. There is a kind of resistance that doesn't announce itself. It is not loud or aggressive. It doesn't shake its fist at the sky or lament the passage of time. It simply refuses to move. The people in the house practiced this resistance. They adjusted nothing. There was no urgency to improve, no longing to update or renew. The cushions remained slightly misshapen from the same weight every evening. The curtains hung where they had been pinned decades ago, with fabric that had faded to the color of old thought. The dishes in the cabinet bore tiny chips around the edges, each one remembered but never mended. There was a kind of preservation in this inaction, not out of laziness or neglect, but something else, something quieter. Change was not something they chased. That sentence, simple as it is, holds an entire worldview. In a time when the world constantly urges forward motion, improvement, growth, and reinvention, there is a certain defiance in choosing stillness. We often associate progress with virtue and stagnation with decay. But the people in the house saw things differently. For them, to remain was not to rot, it was to root, to dig in, to hold ground, to keep sacred the constancy others overlook. They did not resist change in anger. They simply did not see it as necessary. They did not crave novelty or betterment. They did not aspire to transformation. They believed in the life that unfolds through repetition. Their days were quiet, patterned, and familiar. Each morning unfolded like the last, not out of boredom, but out of rhythm. Wait, wash, and sit by the window. Tea made in the same chip kettle. Bread toasted to the same shade. Buttered with the same steady hand. No alarms, no surprises, no reason to rethink a routine that had already proven gentle. In a world where many fear becoming stuck, they cherished the fact that they had settled. They did not seek variation for its own sake. The seasons still moved beyond their control, but they let the changes pass over them rather than through them. The first frost came, and they wrapped the same shawls tighter. The first buds of spring arrived, and they opened no new doors, only windows, and only partway. If a drawer was stuck, it stayed stuck. If a board creaked, it was allowed to creak. These minor flaws became part of the house's language, the way it expressed time. It did not protest the years that wore them, just as the people inside wore their own aging with grace. Their home mirrored its still, steady endurance. Visitors, on the rare occasion one crossed the threshold, often found the house quaint or quiet or charming in a strange way. But few lingered. The stillness, comforting to its residents, made others uneasy. There was no rush to speak here, no small talk to fill the air. Even silence held its place like an honored guest. Conversation, if it occurred at all, moved slowly, meandering between memories rather than chasing ideas. Time did not speed up inside the house, it spread out like a soft rug beneath each moment. Photographs on the wall remained unrotated, their frames gathering a soft film of dust. Faces in them smiled out, not forgotten, but not freshly remembered either. They belonged to a continuity, not a past. The people inside the house did not feel the need to explain them. They were not artifacts, but companions, known by presence rather than story. If something broke, they might set it aside instead of fixing it. Not in frustration, but in peace. Not every broken thing needs to be restored. Some things can simply be remembered as they were. In this house, memory was not always spoken aloud. It lived in the way they folded a blanket, and how the tea leaves were saved for a second steep, in the placement of a stool in the exact right spot beneath the drafty sill. These details were small but sacred. Outside, the world spun in faster loops. Technology surged forward. Streets widened, cities rose taller, and people grew louder. But the house beneath the vane turned inward instead. It did not resist out of fear or protest, it simply remained faithful to its own pace. The people inside saw no need to compete with time. They were not chasing youth or relevance. They were not waiting for something to happen. They were being, and that was enough. What does it mean to choose stillness and a restless world. Perhaps it means knowing who you are deeply enough that you don't feel compelled to reinvent yourself. Perhaps it means honoring the beauty in small repetitions. The daily cup, the same view through the same half-drawn curtain. The sound of a spoon circling a cup exactly 5 times. The house beneath the vein was full of such rituals, quiet ones that didn't draw attention, but gave shape to days. Even the creaks in the floorboards had their places. If one of the people walked down the hall, the other could tell which step they'd reach just by the sound. It was a kind of intimacy that can only grow in stillness, that can only arise from time spent not seeking elsewhere. There is an elegance to familiarity, a depth to constancy that no novelty can provide. And in this house, the depth was everywhere. They did not avoid change as if it were danger. They simply let it pass them by when it had no reason to stay. Not all change is necessary. Not all movement is meaningful. The people in the house had learned that long ago, and they had stopped apologizing for it. To an outside world fueled by urgency and curated reinvention, they might seem stuck. But within the walls of that flaking house, they were deeply, quietly free. Free from the constant pressure to optimize. Free from the fear of being outdated. Free from the anxiety of always reaching for more. They live in the now, not the now that screams for attention, but the now that hums softly under ordinary life. When the wind passed by and nudged the vein into motion, they might glance up, but they wouldn't rise. The wind was only wind. It didn't ask anything of them. They let it pass, as they let all things pass, with open eyes and resting hands. The house beneath the vein did not announce itself. It simply stood, and the people within it did the same. To remain unchanged, not because you are afraid to grow, but because you have already grown into what you need to be. That is a rare kind of strength. A quiet strength. The kind that draws no crowd. The kind that looks like stillness but is actually peace. And so, they stayed. The shutters are halfway drawn. The paint softly curling. The bellwether turning overhead. Inside, the people moved gently through their days, asking nothing of the world but the right to remain as they were. They were not forgotten, though they had stepped out of sight. They had simply chosen a different rhythm. Not everyone needs to chase. Not everyone needs to change. Some just need a house that stays. There are moments that barely register as events, moments that drift in quietly, as if they belong not to time, but to a pause between time. That evening was one of those moments. The day had unfolded much like the ones before it, without any sharp turns or heavy declarations. It moved forward softly, the hours unfurling like cloth across a familiar table. But as the sun began its slow descent, the sky did something it had not done in many evenings. It gathered itself into patterns. That did not feel accidental. The clouds, those usually shapeless companions to dusk, arrived with an unfamiliar intentionality. They weren't dense or heavy with rain, nor were they brushed casually across the horizon in streaks of white and gold. Instead, they arranged themselves in ways that invited noticing. Not dramatic enough to startle, but just curious enough to unsettle, in a very gentle way. They curled and elongated, not into animals or objects as people often imagine, but into forms that resisted naming. Something abstract, something just beyond the edge of conscious recognition. It is a strange thing how the sky can seem to send a message that doesn't use words. These weren't clouds that resembled hearts or dragons or the profile of a face. They resembled something older than that, some echo of a language once known and long forgotten. I tried to read them, and in trying, only grew more uncertain. That uncertainty didn't frighten. It merely lingered, like a scent you almost remember, but not quite. In one small garden bordered by a hedge that had grown at the same angle for decades, a man stood with shears in hand. He had been trimming it as he always did, methodically, without hurry, but also without particular interest. The garden didn't change much season to season. The soil was firm, the hedge always a little unruly, and the rhythm of cutting and stepping, bending and snipping had become second nature. He didn't think about the act as he performed it. He simply maintained the space. But something about the air shifted, not in temperature or wind, but in texture. It was subtle, like the weight of a glance or the sudden awareness that you lay not alone in a room. He paused, squinting upward. The shears hung at his side, forgotten for a moment, the blade dull with time, but still sharp enough to manage the softer stems. His hand, still gloved, rose without thought to shade his eyes, even though the sun wasn't glaring. It was dipping, golden but soft, casting no offense. The squint wasn't a reaction to brightness. It was a squint of confusion, of quiet wonder, of looking at something familiar and realizing you didn't know it as well as you assumed. The clouds had formed shapes that almost felt like symbols, the kind you might find carved into an old, forgotten stone in a place where people used to gather but hadn't in centuries. They weren't readable, naturally, but they suggested something, some hidden order or quiet intention behind the sky's slow rearrangement. He tilted his head slightly. If he just looked at it from another angle, perhaps it would resolve. Perhaps it would make sense. It didn't, and yet, he felt no frustration. Just the gentle ache of an ungraspable idea. A moment of stillness within himself, where something stirred, something he couldn't name, couldn't chase. It stayed just beyond the edge of understanding, like a dream fading on the pillow before the second blink of morning. For a second, he felt smaller but not diminished. Just placed, situated in something bigger. Not a story with heroes or dangers or messages. Just a quiet design that didn't need to be understood to be present. Then, slowly, he blinked, and as easily as he had stopped, he resumed. The shears rose again, his fingers closing around the handles in the way they always did. Snip, step. Snip. The sound was soft but certain. He no longer looked up. The sky could shape itself however it wanted. The hedge still needed trimming. There was something comforting in that, a task that returned every week, predictable and undemanding. The garden had no memory of the clouds. It only responded to the shears, to the steps, and to the wheelbarrow that creaked when he moved it. And yet, the moment, brief as it was, remained folded into the fabric of the evening. It did not insist on itself, but neither did it vanish. It lingered like a whisper in a large room, something you heard only because everything else was quiet enough. The clouds eventually drifted apart, losing their deliberate shapes, dissolving into the more familiar chaos of weather. But the feeling they brought, that subtle tension between the ordinary and the almost meaningful, remained in the air. That day didn't change history. No decisions were made, no announcements delivered, no epiphanies spoken aloud. But that's what made it matter, in its own small way. Because not all significance arrives wrapped in thunder. Some of it comes like a breeze that passes over the surface of still water, barely visible. But they're nonetheless. The man didn't tell anyone about the clouds, not because he was hiding something, but because he didn't think to. What would he have said? That the sky looked strange for a moment, that the shapes made him feel. What exactly? Thoughtful, out of place, seen. Words would only dilute the experience. So he finished the hedge, pushed the wheelbarrow back to its usual corner near the shed, wiped his hands on the same cloth he always used, went inside, made tea inside. The rooms were the same. The dust in the corners, the arrangement of the chairs, the slow tick of the kitchen clock unchanged. He looked out the window once, but only briefly, and not at the sky, just to check the gate was latched. By then, the clouds had shifted again. The symbols, if that's what they were gone. Or maybe they'd never been symbols at all, just accidents of wind and moisture, interpreted by a mind looking for shape. Still, he slept a little differently that night, not uneasily, but with a kind of openness in his rest, as though his dreams had widened to allow for things they normally did not. There were no vivid visions, no prophetic moments, just a sense of space, of something unnamed moving just beyond the edge of familiarity. The next day came like all the others. He went out to his garden again, but there were no strange clouds, just the usual haze of morning, the soft pull of routine. Still, part of him, some quiet, almost childlike part, glanced up without meaning to, not expecting, just remembering. Because that's how moments like these live on. Not in documentation, not in grand retellings, but in small shifts of awareness, in glances that become habit, in silences that feel fuller than they used to, in the quiet knowledge that, just once, the sky tried to say something whether or not it succeeded. And maybe that's all it was meant to do. Not to communicate clearly, not to direct or warn, but simply to remind, to whisper that not everything is understood, and that there is room in life even in the most ordinary days for the unfamiliar to enter softly. That a man can stand in his garden, shears in hand, and be gently unsettled by the sky without needing to change anything. The clouds didn't need to be explained. They only needed to be witnessed. And they were, for a moment, that was enough. There are shifts and a place changes so small they don't make noise. They arrive like a breath held too long or a whisper spoken one room over. The town, in this instance, did not shake or tremble. There were no earthquakes or floods, no sirens or sudden disappearances. There was only the wind, and it came not with violence, but with a new scent, and that was enough. The wind, once accustomed to passing over fields of hay and brushing against lofts and warm barns, now carried something else. River moss, a scent damp, green, alive, and quietly unsettling. Not unpleasant, not sharp, not alarming but unfamiliar. The difference between a page turned and a chapter ended. Most would not think twice, yet for those attuned to subtlety, it marked a departure. The dry hay had always meant comfort, labor, stability. Its presence wrapped around people like a worn coat, one that still held the shape of their shoulders. But now the coat was being taken off, silently, and something else cooler, damper, older was being offered. The alleyways of the town were narrow, shaped not by design, but by time. Stone upon stone, building upon building, laid by hands long gone. They were corridors of memory, not movement. When the wind entered them, it slowed, wound itself like ribbon through corners, pressed gently against shutters that hadn't been opened in months. It asked no questions, demanded no changes. It simply arrived. But still, its arrival was a presence, a suggestion, an invitation, and like all invitations that come softly, it could be ignored without guilt. So it was. People noticed, yes, in the way one might notice a new crack in the wall, or a chair move slightly out of place. Their noses lifted briefly, a glance over the shoulder, then back to the task. The bread still needed to rise. The bucket still needed filling. The boot still needed to be mended, though no one wore them out as quickly anymore. Routines remained sacred not because they were efficient, but because they required no thought. And thought, for many, had become a luxury they could not afford. The scent of river moss was the kind of thing that might have sparked curiosity in a different time, in a younger town, when people still followed trails just to see where they ended. But that spirit had faded, or perhaps been buried under layers of unasked questions and seasons spent simply continuing. Moss was not part of the town's vocabulary. It was too damp, too close to still water, too suggestive of softness where there should be stone. Hay, on the other hand, meant movement, horses, carts, roofs being repaired. Moss meant stillness, decay, things that grew without help or permission. The town did not like such things. Its streets were not hostile, just tired. Its walls bore witness but no longer spoke. And its people well. They had learned to value what stayed the same, not because they loved it, but because it let them move without reconsidering every step. And yet, the wind lingered. It did not roar or rush. It threaded itself gently in the fabric, found its way into the folds of curtains, and left traces on windows. Its scent was patient. It became something that would eventually seem like it had always been there, just another note in the town's background hum. That's how change often works, slowly. Not with revolution, but with redefinition. The dry hay smell would become a memory, then a rumor. Eventually, even that would disappear. What's curious is that even when nothing seems to be happening, everything is. The town looked the same. No bells rang, no doors slammed. But in the smallest gestures, The change began to seed itself. A child hesitated at a window. A shopkeeper paused longer than usual before opening the door. A baker burned the edges of a loaf and couldn't say why. These were not dramatic acts, but they were fractures, hairline cracks in the crust of repetition. Still, no one followed the trail. The trail was not marked. It was not signposted. It was not paved. It was not even truly visible. It was only sensed, a path woven from memory and instinct, from something older than the town itself. And so no one could claim they should have followed it. The town was not being warned. It was being offered something. And offers, unlike demands, can be declined without penalty. The river, some distance away, had always been part of the town, but not of its rhythm. People acknowledged it the way one might acknowledge a sleeping animal, with respect, but not engagement. It fed the fields and carried away waste, but it was not walked beside, not watched. Its surface moved, but no one learned its patterns. It was just there. Now, it too was changing. The moss along its edges had grown thick. Its green was not the bright hue of springtime fields, but the dark, steady tone of things that root deeply. Things that do not ask for light, but take what little there is and thrive. It blanketed the banks like a quilt, silent and certain, and the scent that quiet perfume rose from it in threads, catching the breeze that wandered into town. One could say the river was calling, but only metaphorically. It made no noise. Its current didn't quicken. It didn't swell or retreat. It simply continued, and sometimes continuity itself is enough to unsettle, especially when all else depends on stagnation. There was, perhaps, a time when someone might have followed the trail, some girl with a story she had not yet told, some boy whose shoes were never quite tied properly, someone with a quiet rebellion in their chest and too much time on their hands. But those people had either grown up or left, or worse, they'd learned to pretend that they hadn't noticed, and no one questioned why no one followed. That's the thing about communal silence, it doesn't need agreement. It just needs no one to interrupt it. To follow the scent of river moss would require asking the question, what is this? And that question might lead to another. Why is it here? And then another. What else has changed while we weren't looking? And so, most wisely avoided the first question altogether. It was safer that way simpler, because sometimes a scent is just a scent, but sometimes it is the first line in a story that doesn't belong to the town yet. And what would happen then if they begin reading? So they did not read. They swept their doorways. They mended the same socks. They measured their days by the same bells that had always rung. They did not seek the new smell. They let it settle, become part of the air, until it no longer seemed new at all. Familiarity, after all, can be rewritten. The moss would grow, the river would keep moving, and the wind, never one to stay long where it is not wanted, would eventually carry its messages elsewhere. It would find other towns, other alleyways, other silences are ready to break, because change does not need acceptance to begin. It only needs time. And even the most stubborn familiarity cannot outlast that. There is something deeply evocative in this single image. A weather vane once designed to move with the wind, to indicate direction and change turns just once, hesitantly, almost as if questioning its purpose. The rust that clings to it doesn't signal ruin so much as remembrance. In the quiet of night, beneath the passive, silvery gaze of the moon, time doesn't leap, it lingers. The weather vane becomes more than just metal atop a roof. It becomes a metaphor, a symbol of slow recollection, of stillness teetering at the edge of movement. To begin understanding this moment, we must consider its pace. The motion described as spun once, slowly, is deliberate, not frantic or purposeful, not caught in the grip of a storm or propelled by any great force. This movement, small and uncertain, mirrors a kind of quiet internal shift, like the way one stirs in sleep without waking, or how an old thought resurfaces, fragile and dim, not with urgency, but with soft insistence. The weather vane, typically associated with external conditions, wind, direction, Weather here responds to something quieter, something less measurable than the gale. It acts not in the service of utility, but in response to what? Exactly. A tremor of time, a ghost of memory, as if unsure of itself. This personification arrests us. What could it mean for a tool to hesitate? This is not literal mechanics, it's language that gently tugs the reader towards symbolism. The weather vane here is not merely an object. It becomes a stand-in for forgotten purpose, perhaps even for aging, or legacy, or the body's resistance to the passage of time. When people grow older, when buildings decay, when letters fade on old signs, there is often no dramatic ending. There's just one last action, one final rotation, one spin in the moonlight before stillness. And stillness, in this sentence, is not empty. Then it stopped. A simple line, but pregnant with weight. The act of stopping isn't framed as failure or loss, it's more like resolution. A chapter closing not with punctuation, but with a pause. The weather vane spins once, then ceases. That's all. But in the silence that follows, something else takes the stage. Memory. The moonlight made its rust gleam like memory waking. This is the hinge on which the entire sentence turns. Moonlight is passive. It doesn't impose. It observes. It illuminates gently, without heat or sharpness. So the rust, a sign of age, of disuse, of slow oxidation, is not shown as decay, but rather as something glimmering, something catching light. This is not the golden shimmer of polished brass or the bright glint of youth. This is the muted, dignified glow of what remains. Rust is memory. Rust is proof that something was once vibrant, once used, once needed. What does it mean for memory to wait? Memory, like the weather vane, does not rush. It stirs, often unpredictably. It's not always summoned by will, but sometimes by something as subtle as the angle of the moonlight, or a scent in the air, or the way shadows stretch across a familiar wall. In this sentence, the weather vane doesn't remember, but something around it does. The scene itself recalls. The rust gleams not despite age, but because of it. The years it has weathered, the stillness it has endured, the moments it stood sentinel over a roof long quiet, these are what give it meaning now. There's also a gentle tension between functionality and symbolism here. The weather vane once served a clear, measurable purpose. It turned to show the wind's direction, a simple, mechanical role. But that role is no longer relevant, not because the wind has stopped, but perhaps because no one looks anymore, or because the house it crowns is abandoned, or because people have found other tools. And yet, in this new role, this symbolic one, it gains a new kind of significance. It becomes not a tool, but a keeper of time, of weather, of silence. In many ways, this passage explores the dignity of the forgotten. The world tends to celebrate use, utility, productivity. What functions? What does? But what of things that simply remain? The weather vane, in its hesitant spin, becomes a reminder of those parts of ourselves and our histories that we leave untended, but not unloved. The tools in the shed no longer lifted. The books whose spines have cracked with time. The names we can't remember, but know once mattered. The spin, the pause, the gleam, is all part of a ritual of quiet honoring, of recognizing that the past is not past just because it's still. There's also something subtle and emotional about the act of watching. In this sentence, the narrator, or perhaps simply the narrative voice, watches the weather vane, watches it spin, watches it stop, watches it glisten. And in that act of witnessing, the mundane becomes sacred. How often do we miss these moments? A leaf is drifting, dust dancing in a sunbeam, the sigh of an old floorboard, the hesitation of a tool that once knew what to do. This sentence doesn't shout, it whispers. And in that whisper, we hear the soft breath of history. Consider also the layers of temporality here. The weather vane connects the present moment, a single night, with the accumulated past, all the years that led to its rusting. But it also gestures toward eternity. The moon, the night, the spin, the stillness, all feels cyclical, not linear. Time is not marching here. It's circling. It's spinning once and then holding, which is precisely what memory does. It doesn't carry us forward. It brings us back, The phrase like memory waking is especially tender. Memory, when first waking, is foggy, slow, gentle. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It unfolds, like the weather vane's slow spin. This metaphor also acknowledges that memory sleeps sometimes, that we forget, not because we don't care, but because we are human. And when memory wakes, be it in a moment of moonlight or while standing before a long closed door, it doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes all it needs is a single gleam. There is also something innately human about seeing ourselves in things that no longer work as they once did. The weather vane, after all, is still mounted, still standing. It hasn't fallen. It hasn't been discarded. It hasn't shattered. It simply no longer spins as it used to. But that doesn't mean it's useless. That doesn't mean it's not beautiful. It just means its role has changed from doing to being, from function to presence, from informing to reminding. In a broader sense, this passage encourages us to reflect on the places we've forgotten to look. The rooftops, the edges, the quiet, the forgotten artifacts of homes, villages, lives. What else might be out there, waiting not to be used again, but simply to be seen, simply to be noticed in its current form, whether dignified, quietly glowing in the moonlight? One could even read the weather vane as a kind of symbol of the self. How we once moved with purpose, how we turned instinctively toward direction and duty. And now, perhaps we find ourselves spinning only once, on occasion, not from compulsion, but from a need to feel again. And in that brief spin, we remember not through sharp recollection, but through something softer. A rust gleam, a moonlit sigh. The body doesn't forget. The spirit doesn't fade. It changes form. It waits for the light to catch it, right? Finally, the idea of memory waking through moonlight and rust rather than clarity and color is key. Memory isn't always bright. It isn't always joyful. Sometimes it wakes with the heaviness of age, with the echo of what's been lost, with the weight of unspoken things. But that doesn't diminish its worth. That makes it more poignant, because to remember, even vaguely, even sadly, is to honor. In some, this single moment, just a weather vane spinning slowly in the night, carries with it layers of meaning. It touches on time, on age, on usefulness, on presence, on decay, on observation, and on memory. It speaks not in bold declarations, but in gentle implication. The sentence doesn't ask us to act. It asks us to notice, not to pause, to witness, and maybe that's enough. Sometimes the world doesn't need us to intervene or explain or fix. Sometimes it just needs us to sit quietly in the doorway, like the wax schooler did, and let things turn once, slowly, unsure, and then stop. And to be there when the moonlight glows not on polished silver, but on honest rust. Because in that shimmer, memory wakes, and so do we. There is a quiet rhythm in some lives that becomes so embedded, so consistent, that it no longer demands attention. It does not seek validation, nor does it explain itself. It simply continues, like breath or the ticking of a clock, and remarked upon, yet always there. The act of folding each garment just so belongs to this kind of rhythm. There is no dramatic urgency to it, no witness needed, no applause sought. It is not done for productivity or performance. It is not part of a larger system meant to churn results or produce outcomes. It exists outside those frameworks, in a gentler, older time of being, one where repetition is not monotonous but meditative. The phrase just so reveals something significant. It's not careless folding, nor is it rigidly precise. It is thoughtful but not self-conscious. It carries with it a kind of grace and intimacy with the cloth, a memory in the fingers. Each crease is placed the same way, not because it must be, but because that's how it always has been. There is a comfort in that. A garment folded with care speaks to a memory kept alive through repetition. Maybe it was how her mother folded them, or how someone long gone used to prefer their shirts laid flat, their sleeves tucked, and their corners sharp. Or maybe no one ever asked, it was simply her way, developed over time like a signature you forget how you learned. There's a basket involved to always the same basket. This is important. The sameness is not boring. It is sacred. The basket is not interchangeable with another. It carries the ghost of 1,000 previous Tuesdays. It holds more than fabric kit holds continuity. Perhaps its handles are worn smooth from years of service. Perhaps the wicker creaks slightly when lifted, sounding faintly like the stairs in the back of the house that no one uses anymore. It doesn't need to be repaired because its imperfections are part of the ritual. They are not flaws, they are signs that time has passed and the basket still remains, just as she does. And then there's Tuesday, a specific day. Not Monday, not Sunday, but Tuesday, the middle of the beginning of the week. It is neither rush nor resting, a strange sort of in-between space. Why Tuesday? No one asks, and that is, in itself, the heart of the matter. It is not hidden, it is not secretive, it is simply accepted. The fact that no one questions the act means it has grown beyond logic, it has become truth. The garments will be folded on Tuesday. That is the world. Maybe it started for a reason, a birthday, an anniversary, the day someone returned, or the day someone left. Maybe Tuesday was when the letter came, or when the letter stopped coming. Maybe Tuesday was laundry day because that was when the rain usually held off just long enough. Maybe it was once chosen for practical reasons, and now it is honored like a promise. Maybe she once said, Tuesday works, and then no one ever asked again. The answer has become part of the silence of the house, part of the worn carpet, and part of the faded note pinned behind the pantry door. The house itself probably echoes this rhythm. It breathes Tuesday the way the floorboards breathe heat. Maybe the kettle starts to whistle earlier. Maybe the curtains fall just so in the morning light. Maybe the birds sing a different tune outside the window, not because the birds know, but because she does. The entire structure seems to lean gently toward her motion. The creaking of the basket handle, the low hum of her humming, the rhythmic folding. It is all the sound the house needs to know what day it is. This kind of repetition is not empty. It is not robotic. It is an act of devotion, however quiet. In a world so loud with urgency and progress, there is something deeply profound in someone doing the same thing the same way. Not because they must, but because they choose to. To fold a garment, crease it carefully, and place it gently, without an audience, without any promise of change. This is not small. This is the beating heart of stillness, of tradition, not of care. To live in a way where time is not dictated by a calendar app or a to-do list, but by the body's own sense of what needs doing. That is a different form of knowledge. That is knowing from within. That is memory carried in the wrist, in the back of the neck, and in the tired feet. It is not important in the way the world defines importance, but it matters. The garments must be folded. The basket must be carried. It is Tuesday. The idea that no one asked why speaks volumes about the surrounding world. Perhaps the people in her life are used to her rhythms. They have come to trust them, or perhaps they have forgotten to notice. That is the tension here between reverence and invisibility, between quiet awe and quiet neglect. Some might look past her, assuming she folds laundry because someone has to. Others might pause, just for a second, wondering about her small mystery. The basket, the precision, the Tuesday. Maybe a child once asked, "Why do you fold clothes today?" And she replied, "Because I always have." And that was enough. But maybe no one ever asked. Maybe she, too, has forgotten the original reason. But still, she keeps going, because something in her would feel wrong if she didn't. The act has taken on a shape of its own. Like the grooves in the stairs formed by countless steps, her hands know this motion. Her mind drifts as she works, not absent, but open. There is space in the folding, space for remembering, space for forgetting, space for nothing at all. There is something spiritual in this act, even if no one would call it that. It is a private liturgy, a one-woman ceremony, each sleeve tucked the same way, each corner smoothed, not for perfection, but for peace. In these small movements, she holds the fragments of a life, hers, someone else's, both, or neither. Folding is a gesture that tucks something away but does not discard it. It makes room. It allows something to rest. She folds not to erase the day, but to acknowledge it. The garments may be worn again, but this moment, this folding belongs only to Tuesday. And if one Tuesday she stops, if the basket sits untouched, if the fabric lies loose, if the folds do not appear, would someone notice? Would the absence echo in the house? Would the floor sigh differently? Would someone finally ask, why was it always Tuesday? And would there be an answer? Or perhaps, even then, no one would ask, and the silence would speak instead, because the true weight of such a ritual is often felt only in its absence. The folded garments are not remembered, but the unfolded ones, they are none. That's when people notice. That's when they remember that something once happened every Tuesday. Until then, the basket will be filled again. The fabrics, cotton, linen, and wool will pass through her hands like time itself. Each fold is a line drawn gently through the passing days. Each crease a whisper that says, I was here. I did this. I cared in the quiet way people forget to name. She doesn't rush. She doesn't slow down either. Her pace is what it needs to be. The folds appear. The basket is filled, and then it is carried maybe to the same room, maybe down the same hallway where the light falls the same way it did last week and the week before. She sets the basket down. She exhales, and the moment closes like a book not quite finished. Nothing extraordinary happens, and yet everything happens. A whole history folds into fabric and time. The creases will relax. The garments will be worn. The basket will be empty. But Tuesday will return, and so will she, because some things don't need a reason. They only need a rhythm and a pair of steady hands. And the silence that comes after everything is folded, and nothing is left to do but carry it forward. In the quiet margin of a world that seems to have forgotten its need for grandeur, there is a small stretch of court between two trees. It is not just a piece of rope. It is a silent witness to continuity. Her line hung deliberately, reliably, and without spectacle has endured more than weather. It has endured time, stretched between the two trees that have grown slowly, almost imperceptibly, over the years. The line does not sag from neglect. Rather, it bows from use, from purpose, from having been asked to carry the weight of ordinary life again and again. This bowing is not a flaw, but a gesture of grace, a kind of humility from the inanimate, as if the rope itself understands its role in the ongoing rhythm of domestic ritual. That this line is hers is important. It implies not just possession, but stewardship. It belongs to her, yes, but more deeply, she belongs to it too. She has tended it, relied on it, and perhaps spoken to it once or twice when alone in the yard, more out of habit than hope of reply. The trees remember her routine better than most people do. The rope has felt her hands more times than any door handle. It has carried garments for drying, perhaps for airing out, for sun bleaching, or for saving. Some of those garments might be older than she is now, worn by others long gone. She has pegged them gently but securely, never rushing the placement of a cloth espin. Each motion is measured not by efficiency, but by consistency. Some rituals are too quiet to be called sacred, and yet they are. The bow of the line is its memory. It doesn't snap back, taut and pristine. It isn't trying to pretend it hasn't served. It holds its dip the way a well-used chair holds the memory of a body. It is an artifact not of design, but of experience. Some might look at it and say it's worn. Others, knowing better, might say it's honest. The dip is not neglect. The dip is years of cloth, water, weather, and her quiet footsteps between the trees. It is her, reflected back not in appearance, but in devotion. The cloth espins creak, not loudly, not definitely, but persistently, in the way old wood tends to do when it has accepted its function so fully that even aging cannot prevent its usefulness. Each creak is a testament. I am still here. I still hold. The sound is neither a complaint nor a warning. It is simply the voice of wood that has been shaped by hand and time. In some ways, the cloth espins are more honest than we are. They do not pretend to be new. They creak openly. They do not hide that they have been in service for a long time. That they never failed her is not just technical. It is relational. They never snapped her fingers. They never dropped what they were meant to hold. They never turned brittle when the air grew cold. This trustworthiness has weight. In a world where change is often demanded, where people moved quickly to notice what holds them up. Her cloth espins remained faithful. Their creak is not a flaw. It is a sound of history in motion. She could hang up anything: sheets, dresses, rags, hand-washed scarves, and walk away with the full assurance that the pins would do what they were made to do. This sentence, simple on its surface, holds within it an entire philosophy. It is a philosophy of care through repetition, of reverence without spectacle. It is about continuing to perform small tasks with full presence, even when no one watches. It is about tending to a world that no longer makes headlines but still breathes through small gestures. Her line, her trees, her cloth espins, they do not exist for praise. They exist because someone kept using them. They exist because she never stopped believing in the necessity of small, consistent acts. Consider the space behind the house. It is not landscaped for beauty. It is not curated for guests. It is not trimmed or broadcasted on a postcard. It is simply a space made meaningful by habit. Those trees may have grown around the line, subtly changing its shape, but always accommodating its function. The ground beneath may show faint footprints or flattened grass where she has stood every week, every day, or whenever weather allowed. If you stepped into this space, you would feel it, the resonance of repetition. You would not need to see her to know she had been there. The line would tell you. The cloth espins would echo her rhythm. And what hangs on that line? Perhaps no longer children's clothes. Maybe not uniforms or fine dresses. Perhaps now it is mostly linens, pillowcases, towels, or occasional old shirts she can't bring herself to throw away. Each item, once pegged and left to dry, carries within it a part of her life, a mundane record of living, of sweating, of cleaning, of preparing for tomorrow. The drying fabric shifts slightly in the breeze, casting shadows that flicker on the grass. And even if the air is still, the items hang like prayer flags, absorbing sun and time. They are reminders that care does not need applause. In her absence, should she someday no longer walk between those trees, someone might see the line and think it unremarkable. Just a rope, just two trees, just old wooden pegs. But they would be mistaken. That line is a lifeline to continuity. It is the physical trace of a person's quiet fidelity to daily life. It is proof that something was maintained not because it had to be, but because it deserved to be. Some might measure a life by milestones. Others, like her, measure it by how many loads of laundry dried in the wind and how often the cloth espins creaked but held fast. There is also memory here, not only hers, but the memory of the objects themselves. Memory without words. The wood remembers her hands. The rope remembers the stretch. The trees remember the angle of the sun when she came out in the morning to hang the first shirt. The entire setting is a preserved moment, stretched out over years, gently deepened by the weight of continuity. No grand event marks it. No single moment of drama defines it. Instead, it is built on thousands of repetitions, none more important than the last. Perhaps she once tried new pegs. Perhaps the new one snapped, or didn't grip as well, or simply lacked the right weight in her hand. Maybe that's why she stayed with the creaking ones, because they knew how to hold, without letting go. The same way the trees held the line. The same way she held her days together, one small gesture at a time. To someone else, the bowed line might seem sagging. To her, it is curved like a smile, not one of amusement, but one of quiet knowing. A smile that belongs to someone who has spent a lifetime choosing simplicity over spectacle. That line has outlasted fashions, presidents, fads, and arguments. It has waited in the wind and the rain. It has stood empty in winter and overflowed in spring. It has been, and it remains. Even the phrase behind the house says something essential. This is not a front yard display. This is not for show. It is a private commitment to rhythm and care. It is where she steps out without needing to explain herself. There are no witnesses but the birds, the trees, and the cloth espins. But that is enough. That is more than enough, because the work is still real. The care is still given. And the cloth espins, creaking in affirmation, still do their job. And perhaps that is the point of it all. Not just the sentence, but the life behind the sentence. That there is quiet resilience in doing something well, doing it long, and doing it without demand for recognition. That there is beauty in the way cloth espans creak and still hold. That there is dignity in the bowed line between trees. That behind the house, away from the noise of the world, there is a woman who has chosen care over haste and, in doing so, has left behind not just a line, but a legacy. The world may forget to look, but that doesn't matter. The line remains, the cloth espans wait, and the trees, steady and unchanged, hold their ends of the rope as if cradling something sacred. There is a kind of quiet insistence in routine or rhythm so deeply worn into a person's movements that it becomes almost invisible, like the way a path forms across a field, simply because someone keeps walking the same line. In this case, it was laundry, and Tuesday, and the rain, and a woman who didn't let weather decide what would or wouldn't be done. She had done this so many times that she no longer paused to consider the practicality of it. The act of hanging clothes had long ago ceased being a chore, and had become instead a kind of weekly meditation, a steady procession of motions wringing, folding, clipping, arranging. She had a way with her hands that suggested not urgency but familiarity, even as the clouds pressed themselves flat against the windows and the roof tapped steadily. With the sound of soft rain, her resolve never shifted. Rain was not a reason to stop. It was just another version of the day. Tuesdays were for washing. Always had been. She had likely chosen that day years ago for no particular reason other than it followed Monday and preceded Wednesday. And once chosen, it stuck. Like the way certain mugs always found their way into morning hands, or how she always began, folding with the towels first. It gave her a weak spine. So when the rain came, as it often did in this part of the world, slow, deliberate, as if it were caught in its own kind of routine, she did not sigh or wait it out. She adapted. The indoor drying method had its own choreography. She would pull the wooden rack from the wall, unfolding it like a puzzle she had solved 1,000 times. Its legs creaked a little with age, but it held steady. She laid out towels beneath it, thin ones, old ones, sacrificed long ago to this purpose. They absorbed the quiet drip, drip, drip from sleeves and hems with patient dedication, never complaining. She didn't use the new towels, of course. Those were folded precisely and stored in the airing cupboard for guests who rarely came. Clotheslines indoors changed the air of the house. The sense of damp fabric, soap, and smoke from the hearth mingled into a smell that was not quite pleasant, but entirely familiar. It was a scent of domestic insistence, of practical care, and there was beauty in it, even if no one noticed. The shirts and dresses, socks and aprons, hung like quiet declarations that life was still being tended to, even in the small and unseen ways. She didn't think of it as an act of resilience. She never would have used a word like that. It was just Tuesday, and it was raining, and the clothes needed to dry. But resilience lives in small decisions more than grand ones. It lives in the way someone chooses to carry on in the face of inconvenience, not catastrophe. It's in the refusal to be undone by minor disruptions, in the trust that what matters, clean sheets, dry clothes, a warm fire, can still be accomplished, even if the day doesn't cooperate. As she moved through her house, she created a map of care. The rack by the hearth, the drip-catch towels beneath. The fire was kept just high enough to warm, not scorch. The dog curled in the corner, nose tucked beneath its tail, used to the routine, even on rainy days. She moved without needing to think. Her body remembered the order of things, even if her mind was somewhere else. Outside, the rain thickened, streaking the windows with its soft insistence. The garden beyond blurred into a watercolor of green and gray. But inside, the rhythm held. This wasn't a story anyone would write down. No one kept records of how she moved from line to line, checking each pen, spacing the clothes so they'd dry evenly. No one marked the year she started doing it this way, or noticed when she stopped hanging certain shirts, perhaps because the people who wore them had grown up or moved on. But that didn't make it any less meaningful. Some of the most sacred acts are the ones no one watches. There had been times, long ago, when she had considered buying a machine for drying. Others had suggested it. Quicker. They'd said easier. But something in her hesitated. Not because she didn't like change, but because some tasks held more than their surface function. Drying laundry wasn't just about dry clothes. It was a way of holding the day steady, a way of being present, attentive, and useful. And then there was the fire, always tended carefully, kept alive from ember to flame. It didn't roar or blaze, it crackled gently. It was not heat for show, but for work, for warmth, yes, but also for drying damp shirts and socks, for warming tea and soup, and for sitting beside in the quiet minutes when the world paused just enough to be felt. Sometimes, as she sat near it, watching steam rise from a damp collar or tracing the flames slow dance, she remembered other rainy Tuesdays. Somewhere the house had been fuller children racing from room to room, leaving muddy footprints that made her sigh but never quite scold. Somewhere the silence was deeper, freshly made by absence, but the routine never faltered. In grief, joy, boredom, and illness it remained, a gentle defiance. There was something deeply human in that, the persistence of small acts, the refusal to surrender them to convenience or weather. We often mistake meaning for magnitude, but she understood, without needing to explain it, that meaning is often microscopic, that folding shirts in silence while rain taps the roof can be as sacred as any ceremony, that setting of towels to catch the drip is its own kind of offering to time, to care, to continuity. If you had asked her why she still did it this way, she probably wouldn't have answered with poetry. She might have shrugged, said something about habit, or how it didn't make sense to heat the whole house for just a few damp clothes. But underneath that answer, the truth would still be there, folded deep like linen stored for another season. She understood, perhaps instinctively, that living is not about waiting for the perfect conditions. It is about working gently with what you are given, turning even the most ordinary inconveniences into rituals of care. Rain didn't stop her, because the work still mattered, because the act itself, however quiet, was an affirmation. The world still needed tending. The days still asked to be moved through kindly, even when wet, and so the towels beneath the rack soaked up the excess. The clothes dried slowly, the fire flickered, and outside, the rain fell on the garden, on the hedges, and on the path she'd walk tomorrow. Eventually, the sky would clear. The rack would fold away. The towels would be wrung and washed again. And Tuesday would pass into Wednesday, like it always did. But the quiet devotion of the day is steady. Rain-slick patience would remain, stitched into the fabric of the home like the scent of wood smoke and cotton. Like the hush that settles after the last shirt is pinned. It would remain, even if no one noticed, even if no one remembered. Rain didn't stop her, and in that refusal was a quiet strength the world could easily miss. But that strength warmed the house, dried the clothes, and kept the rhythm of living intact one slow Tuesday at a time. In a village where memory blurred into habit and time drifted without urgency, there was a woman who washed clothes that no one claimed. The garments were neither new nor noticeably tattered, just plain tunics, linens, shawls, and the occasional hand-sewn kerchief. They bore no embroidery or name tags, no particular scent or marking that would tell of their origin. They were simply there, as if they had always been, like the stones in the garden path or the pews in the chapel that no longer held sermons. Each week, without fail, she collected them. They hung in the same place, on a rail behind the shuttered east wing of the old house, a place where ivy crept through cracked bricks and windows fogged without ever being wiped clean. Some speculated the garments had been left by travelers long gone. Others whispered that they once belonged to a family who had vanished during a winter. No one clearly remembered, but truly, no one knew. And over time, no one bothered to ask. The clothes had become background and challenged and unexamined, yet she kept washing them. It wasn't a chore for her, nor an obligation. It was something she did because it had always been done. Or perhaps not always, but long enough that the beginning no longer mattered. She would rise with the same rhythm as the crows that circled the spire, collect water from the pump, its handle long since worn smooth by hands that preceded hers, and fill the basin with care. The soap, made in small batches and stored in wrapped cloth, soften her palms over time, though her knuckles always bore the red sheen of cold water and friction. Each article of clothing was handled as if it belonged to someone who might knock on the door any moment to reclaim it. She checked seams, patched tiny holes, and laid them out to dry in neat rows, smoothing them as if a crease might offend a returning owner. She spoke to them occasionally not with words, but with the care of her actions, the kind of silent reverence one offers to something undeserved yet kept. The townsfolk didn't question her. They knew her as the one who washed clothes that weren't hers, and that was enough of a definition. In small places where lives cross the same paths each day, people settle into roles like stones into riverbeds. The questions stop not because they're answered, but because they grow moss and blend into the landscape. Her habit became a gentle ritual, part of the ambient rhythm of the town. A familiar image, her hunched form over the wash basin, the way her fingers pinched the linen to wring it out, the slow methodical hanging of fabric over lines that stretched from tree to tree, like forgotten boundaries. But the strangeness of it persisted, even if it no longer startled. The clothes never tore with age. They never multiplied nor disappeared. They remained precisely as many as they had been, and though she washed them weekly, they bore no scent of mildew, no sign of wear from repeated laundering. Some noticed this, in passing, but didn't dwell on it, not because they weren't curious, but because curiosity requires effort, and the town had long ago traded wonder for routine. Children, once bold enough to ask, would approach her with wide eyes and questions hanging just behind their teeth. "Whose are they?" one girl had once whispered. The woman didn't answer. She merely pressed a dry cloth into the child's hand and showed her how to fold it. The moment became a lesson, not an explanation. And the girl, like others before and after her, learned not to ask again. There were theories, of course, whispered in kitchens and under shared blankets. Some said the clothes belonged to the dead, and she washed them so their memories wouldn't fade completely. Others believed she had once lost someone, a child, a husband, or a sister, and continued the ritual in their honor. A few suspected magic, though their voices lowered when they said it, because the idea was both too old and too dangerous to resurrect. But none of the theories were ever confirmed. The woman herself never told a story. She lived in the small house near the orchard, the one with the crooked gate and the row of drying pegs nailed evenly along the fence. She lit a candle every evening at the same hour, and her windows always smelled of lavender and clean wool. Her silence wasn't harsh or distant. It was simply present, like fog that doesn't demand attention, but makes everything quieter. And so the clothes continued to be washed on one particularly windless afternoon, when the town had gone still in the kind of waiting that accompanies too much silence. She hung the same shirt she always did, light brown, stitched at the collar, and paused. Not because the shirt was different, but because something in the air had shifted. The birds were late in returning to their trees. The shadows grew longer before the sun had even begun to dip. Still, she said nothing. She pinned the sleeves and adjusted the hem, then moved on to the next. Later that evening, a traveler passed through. He was not remarkable, no flowing cloak or gleaming sword. Just a man with tired boots and the look of someone used to asking for nothing. He stopped at the edge of the orchard and watched her quietly. "I knew someone who wore that," he said, pointing to a shirt as he spoke. She turned, not startled, but aware. Her eyes searched his face for the kind of recognition that lingers between memory and myth. "They've been here a long time," she said. "No one came to claim them." He didn't step forward. Maybe they forgot. She didn't respond. She turned back to the wash line and adjusted a corner where the fabric had begun to twist. The traveler stayed for a while, then moved on. He didn't return, and no one else asked again. That exchange did not change the ritual, but it did leave a tremor in the town, a brief sense that perhaps these garments had stories, ones too faint to follow but too familiar to fully dismiss. Yet still, life continued. Markets opened. Bells chimed at their usual hours. Rain came when it was due, and the woman kept washing the clothes. Over the years, she grew slower, But the ritual never stopped. The clothes remained unchanged, always clean, always waiting. When she could no longer wring them by hand, she found other ways, pressing them gently, letting them dry longer under softer sun. The town aged with her. Shops shuttered, then reopened under new names. The chapel lost its roof and then gained a garden in its nave. The stones in the garden path were rearranged, but her clothesline stayed the same. Eventually, she stopped appearing. One morning, the wash basin was dry. The clothes hung, but they were still. The pump's handle had dust. Her gate was ajar, but the door remained closed. The town noticed in the way that absence is noticed when routine skips a step. People came, peered inside, and whispered. Some brought food. Some stood silently and walked away. No one touched the clothes. Days passed. The clothes remained. No one moved them. No one dared. They stayed on the line through weather and time, unmoved and unclaimed. And in the strange stillness of that section of the orchard, a quiet reverence grew. The area around the pegs became something like a shrine, not to a person, nor a memory, but to a question that was never answered, a task that was never finished, and a care that was never explained. The new generation didn't know who had first washed the clothes. They just knew that they had always been there. Some took to sitting nearby, sketching or writing in journals, recording things they didn't understand. Others hung offerings, a small thread, a folded note, a piece of ribbon. The clothes still fluttered in the wind, patient and clean. And one day, no one remembered who filled the basin again. Not an imitation, but continuation. Because the clothes still needed care. Not because they belonged to anyone, but because they had once been washed, and that was enough. The memory of the woman faded as memories tend to do. Her name blurred, her house changed owners, and her belongings folded into others. But the clothes endured, not sacred, not magical, just remembered enough to be tended. They didn't belong to anyone who lived there now, but someone kept washing them. Certain phrases carry more than meaning, they carry the weight of a lifetime, compressed into a single sentence. This line is one of them. It is not merely a poetic image, but a quiet, resonant story of aging, memory, routine, and the deeply human compulsion to carry forward things we no longer need, simply because they once mattered. It holds both metaphor and motion, tracing the outline of a life through the enduring act of walking a familiar path. To begin with, the phrase "even after her hands slowed and her eyes dimmed" immediately locates us in a late chapter of a person's life. The use of "even after" signals that we are not talking about youth or even middle age. This is the twilight. The hands, which perhaps once moved quickly, may be knitting, working, scrubbing, or holding, have slowed. Age has crept into her joints. Perhaps arthritis has stiffened them, or fatigue has claimed the dexterity she once took for granted. The eyes, once sharp, now dim, speak to the gradual blurring of the world. Text harder to read. Faces slightly out of focus, colors fading into one another. And yet, even with the diminishment of physical ability, the will, the habit, the memory, the ritual remains intact. She still walks. She still walked the path to the line. The phrase "still walk" conveys not just repetition, but resilience. There is a commitment here, not necessarily to purpose, but to continuity. There is something sacred about the path to the line, as if this small journey contains more than its physical distance. It suggests a ritual, perhaps to a clothesline in the backyard, the kind held up between two wooden poles with cloth espins waiting in a tin bucket. Perhaps it is the same stretch of packed earth or worn stone she has stepped across for decades, through seasons and decades, under summer suns and cloudy dusks. It is a path so familiar it no longer needs thought. Her feet remember it even if her mind has grown foggy. The word "line" here may mean the clothesline, something once central to daily domestic life, now mostly symbolic in many modern settings. Or it may be more metaphorical, a demarcation of memory, a threshold between present and past. But assuming it is a physical clothesline, the act of walking to it daily becomes a kind of personal devotion. In a world that has perhaps moved on from her rituals and rhythms, she continues. She walks not because someone has asked her to, or because it is necessary, but because it is a part of her, a habit etched into muscle and memory. And in doing so, she maintains a connection to something important, perhaps to the life she once led, or to the people who were once there with her. Then comes the heart of the sentence, carrying the past like it was laundry that needed airing. This is a powerful image. On the surface, it is domestic and mundane. Laundry needing airing is an ordinary task, a part of daily routine, done without fanfare. But the metaphor elevates it. She is not just carrying sheets and clothes. She is carrying the past. Memories, regrets, joys, losses. The phrase suggests that these memories are not folded away or sealed in a drawer. Instead, they are exposed, hanging in the open air, catching sunlight and breeze, swaying gently in the wind. This evokes the idea that the past, for her, is not a buried thing. It is not boxed up and forgotten. It lives alongside her in the daily rhythm of her life. It is taken out, reviewed, aired out, not necessarily understood or resolved, but allowed to breathe. There's a tenderness here, an emotional housekeeping. Some things she may return to every day. A child's shirt she can no longer fold. A partner's coat she still imagines brushing clean. Other memories might stay bundled for months before being opened again, but all are part of her internal cycle. The metaphor also suggests that memory, like laundry, can carry a kind of weight. You cannot carry everything at once. Sometimes you must make multiple trips. You pick up what you can. What still matters most? What has clung to your skin? And the airing is both literal and symbolic, letting things go into the open, subject to time and wind and weather. Not necessarily to be judged or fixed, but simply acknowledged. Here, she might say without speaking, "This is still with me." There is also something deeply humble about the domesticity of this metaphor. In literature, the past is often portrayed with grandeur, haunting, nostalgic, dramatic. But here, it is laundry, something ordinary, repetitive, necessary. It's not glamorized. The past is not a museum, it's part of the daily mess, something that gets dirty, something that needs care. And yet, by using this imagery, the sentence gives domesticity its due reverence. The things we carry day after day, the small habits, the little rituals are the framework of a life. This line also gestures toward a profound loneliness, though gently so. There's no mention of others. We don't hear footsteps beside her, or voices calling to her from the house. We are simply told she walks, she carries, she remembers. There is a poignancy to the image, this lone figure continuing her quiet ritual even as the world may have forgotten. But it's not tragic. There is no bitterness in her motion, no rage against age or time. She moves forward not because she is lost, but because she knows the way. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of the sentence. She knows the way. Not in the sense of destination or progress, but in that she knows how to continue. She may not know what day it is or what year. Her hands may tremble, her vision blur, but she knows how to carry the past, and she knows how to make the walk. That knowledge, passed down in bone and breath, is what remains. There is also a quiet defiance in the act. In a world that often forgets the elderly, that sidelines routine is obsolete, that views slowness as weakness, she persists. She is not doing something new or useful by modern standards, but in continuing the ritual, she insists that the past is not gone. That memory, though weathered and worn, still has a place in the present. She carries it not for applause or recognition, but because it is hers. And in that carrying, she honors it. This line also touches on grief, but not in a loud, overwhelming way. It's a subtle grief, the kind that lives in repetition. The way we continue making tea for two, even when one cup goes untouched. The way we still open the window every morning, even after the reason for doing so has long since passed. Her walk is a form of mourning, perhaps, but also of devotion. The past is not a burden she resents. It is something she feels responsible for. If she does not air it, who will? And perhaps this is what makes the image so rich. It resists finality. She is not at the end, though her body may be. She is still doing, still remembering, still participating. In a world that values youth, speed, and innovation, she remains rooted in something quieter, but no less valuable: presence. And not just any presence, but the kind that draws from the well of memory, that moves forward not in haste, but in care. In the end, this sentence is a portrait, a full and nuanced one. We may not know her name or her history, but we know her essence. We see her walking a little slower, a little more carefully along a path that matters more than its destination. We see the outline of her life in the movement of her hands, the tilt of her head, the way she hangs the past out to dry. She reminds us that the everyday is sacred, that memory deserves attention, and that even as time dims our sight, it does not erase our purpose. And so, we return to the beginning. Even after her hands slowed and her eyes dimmed, she still walked the path to the line, carrying the past like it was laundry that needed airing. And that sentence is a story of aging, of memory, of grace. It tells us that even when much is lost, speed, clarity, even companionship, something endures. A sense of self, a sense of duty, a tenderness toward the past. She walks, and in that walk, she reminds us that not all continuance is about momentum. Some of it is about care. Some of it is about love. Some of it is simply about remembering who we are, one step at a time. In the still rhythm of village life, time was not merely a measurement, it was a structure, a boundary, a familiar hand guiding the day. The village clock, old and dignified in its tower, had long been the keeper of that rhythm. Every hour it marked was a nod to repetition. 7 meant bread out of the oven. 7 meant lamps lit in windows. 7 meant the same quiet nods exchanged across cobblestone lanes, and shutters drawn against the falling light. Time was not an idea, but a fact. And so, when the village clock struck 7, it did so with the kind of certainty no one questioned. But then came a shift, subtle at first, not jarring, not catastrophic. No thunder, no bells tolling differently in tone or voice. It struck 7 as always, but then it ticked forward, not just as part of its usual function, but into a place unfamiliar, into an hour that seemed untouched by routine. This passage of time, the next minute, the next second, unfolded in a way that felt almost foreign. Not wrong-eyed, just new, unworn. Like stepping onto the first stair of a staircase you didn't know existed. The village itself didn't immediately notice. It never did with small changes. The bread still cooled in window sills. The lamp still flickered in slow, pulsing orange. But something beneath the familiar surface began to shift quietly. The clock, has continued ticking past where they are usually dissolved into silence, seemed to thread a new kind of presence through the air. It didn't chime again. It didn't need to. It simply kept time that no one had asked for. For years, perhaps decades, maybe even centuries, the clock had served as more than just a device. It was woven into the daily expectation of what followed what. It marked the morning chores, the afternoon shadows, the ringing of distant tools. Even the birds, in their own way, sang around its rhythm. Life did not revolve around it because it had to, but because it could. The clock gave permission. It created closure. 7 o'clock was not just a time. It was a line drawn across the evening, telling everyone, this is where one thing ends and another begins. But now, that line wasn't a boundary. It was a bridge. It extended into something no one had written down. It was unlit by lanterns, unmapped by footsteps. And though most villagers continued as if nothing had changed, pouring tea, brushing crumbs from tabletops, fastening windows shut, there was an undercurrent in the air. Like the hush before a storm that never comes. Something was open. It's tempting to say time had broken, but it hadn't. It had simply remembered that it could continue. A woman in her kitchen paused mid-motion. Her hand lingered on the teapot's handle. She wasn't sure why. Nothing had startled her, but there was something in the room that felt slightly unmoored. She glanced at the clock on her wall, smaller, a reflection of the great one in the square, and noted it to tick on, though its sound seemed fuller than usual. as if each tick was being drawn from some deeper place. She let her hand fall. The tea could wait. Outside, an old man resting on a bench beneath the chestnut tree blinked into the dusk. He had sat in the same spot every evening for 15 years, watching the same view, greeting the same hour. But tonight, something in the way the shadows stretched seemed off measure. Not darker, not longer, just rearranged. He reached for his cane, then didn't stand. He wasn't tired, he wasn't restless, but for the first time, and as long as he could remember, he didn't know what this moment was supposed to be, because that's what the clock had done. Ticking past the known, it had created a moment without precedent. A boy, drawing circles in the dust near the bakery's door, looked up. He'd always listened for the 7 o'clock strike, because it meant his father would call him in for supper. But tonight, his father didn't call. Not late, just not yet. And the boy, in his way, noticed. He didn't feel alarm, only the sensation that time was not quite behaving the way it usually did. He kept drawing, this time not in circles, but in long spirals that led off into the untouched dust. Elsewhere, a candle burned lower than expected, despite being lit at the same hour as always. A pair of shoes, regularly retrieved from the stoop by a passing errand boy, remained untouched. A letter, left half-written, stayed the way not out of interruption, but simply because the writer didn't feel the need to finish. And all the while, the village clock ticked. Each second it added now seemed to lay itself gently on top of the world. A feather of time, light, quiet, almost shy, as if unsure whether it belonged here, as if asking permission to continue. The thing is, no one had ever told time to stop before. But in the deep traditions of the village so shaped by custom, by habit, by things continuing as they always had, it had simply stopped being asked to do anything new. It had become a background actor in a play where the script never changed. 7 o'clock had come and gone every night, and each night life settled into its shape around it. So when the clock didn't stop when it kept ticking, it was not breaking the script. It was simply acknowledging that a script could end, and another could begin. But the village wasn't ready to name the shift. It didn't need to. The people in it responded the way people do to soft change, with glances that lasted a little longer, with breaths held just a fraction too long, with small tasks left unfinished. No one ran into the square shouting. No one demanded an explanation. It was just a moment that no one recognized, and that was enough. The child did eventually get called in. The woman eventually poured the tea. The man on the bench finally stood and made his way home, though slower than usual, his cane tapping out a new rhythm. The candles were snuffed. The shutters were latched. The last fire crackled into coals. And all the while, the village clock, high in its stone tower, kept ticking. Not urgently, not insistently, just honestly. But what's most striking is that the clock itself had not changed. Its hands moved with the same precision. Its gears turned with the same worn effort. But something in its continuation past the familiar hour had allowed everything else to remember that life does not need to be the same to be safe. That time, when unbound, doesn't threaten, it invites. The next morning, there would be questions, perhaps. Some would remark on the strange sensation in the air. Others might notice their dreams had felt unusually lucid. A few might confess to having woken up feeling older or younger or just different. But no one would quite say why. And the clock, when it struck 8 the next evening, would do so as if it always had. Yet something had shifted, permanently. Because 7 o'clock was no longer the end of something. It was no longer the edge of a known shape. It had become the center of a widening circle. The village still stood. The tower still watched over it. But time now had the freedom to move in directions no one had considered. It no longer stopped at the familiar. It carried onward, and in that onwardness was something tender. Not revolutionary, not wild, just new. Gently, almost reverently, new. Because even in the quietest places, even in the smallest, most ordered lives, there comes a moment when time decides to do more than repeat. It breathes. It wanders. It stretches out its hands into a moment no one yet understands. and in doing so, reminds everyone that life isn't just made of hours that come again but of moments that come once, without asking, and change everything in their wake. There is something strangely potent about the moment described here, though on the surface it might feel simple or even forgettable. This is not a paragraph that shouts. It doesn't dramatize or explain itself, it simply offers a moment, still and unsettled. But when pulled apart slowly and respectfully, it reveals a quiet but layered atmosphere, one in which time seems slightly misaligned and human routine is faltered in response. Let's begin with the first sentence. People paused, unsure if it was truly evening. That phrase alone captures an unusual disruption in the natural rhythm of life. Evening is typically unmistakable, a time of transition, marked by the sinking of the sun, the lengthening of shadows, the turning inward of daily life. But here, that certainty has been suspended. The people, plural, meaning this isn't an isolated experience, have reached a point in their day where their senses can no longer rely on what they usually recognize. They hesitate. They do not know whether the day is ending or if something else entirely is happening. This pause is subtle but profound. It is not born of catastrophe, but of confusion and hesitation that spreads not because of fear, but because of unfamiliarity. In a world that is typically so rhythm-bound, morning routines, lunch hours, nightfall rituals, a pause like this disrupts not just behavior, but belief. It makes one question what time really is, and whether it is a dependable measure, or merely something we've grown used to accepting. The reason for this uncertainty is gently hinted at in the next line. The shadows didn't stretch right. Here, we move from the people to their environment. Light and shadow tools we instinctively use to navigate time have failed them. The phrase doesn't say there were no shadows, or that it was too dark or too bright. It says they didn't stretch right. That phrase alone is quietly disorienting. Shadows always stretch in the evening, pulled long and slantwise by the setting sun. But here, the direction, the length, the shape, something does not align. It isn't necessarily wrong, but it's off. And that slight misalignment is enough to confuse everyone. There is a beautiful kind of psychological echo in this, that sometimes it doesn't take a catastrophe to shake us. Sometimes, all it takes is for one familiar thing to feel off. A shadow, for instance, stretching not toward the east but slightly to the side. Not enough to scream alarm, but enough to whisper unease. The third sentence shifts to an effect. Meals were left uneaten. This line gives weight to the confusion. It's no longer just about visual dissonance. The disruption in perception has moved into behavior. Food left on the table, untouched not from lack of hunger or absence of preparation, but from the sheer disorientation of not knowing what moment it truly is. Evening is often the time for meals, but if one cannot tell that evening has arrived, then the instinct to sit down and eat falters. The body may be hungry, the food may be warm, but something in the air has unsettled the habit. There is a subtle emotional undercurrent here too. Uneaten meals speak to a stillness that is not entirely peaceful. They suggest waiting, hesitation, or the sense that something has gone awry. It evokes a kind of twilight suspension, as if life has been put on hold by the failure of light to act as it should. When meals are uneaten, it signals more than confusion, it signals that people are holding back, unsure whether to act or retreat. And finally, curtains fluttered. This image seems small, perhaps even decorative at first glance, but it anchors the whole passage in motion and atmosphere. It's a detail that breathes. In contrast to the human stillness, the pause, the uneaten food, the curtain still moves. It suggests when, an open window, or perhaps the passage of time itself as it brushes against the edges of a house, unsure of the hour. But there is also a kind of ghostliness to this image. Fluttering curtains often appear in stories as signs of things unseen, of arrivals, of departures, of presence felt but not defined. It implies that the world outside still moves, even as the people inside hesitate. So what are we really seeing in this scene? We're witnessing a moment of unspoken unease, not one tied to any grand event, but to the quiet and slightly uncanny feeling that something isn't right, even though it almost is. Everything appears to be normal on the surface. There are shadows, meals, curtains, people, and yet the internal logic that holds these elements together, the feeling of knowing what time it is, what should come next, what to trust has unraveled. It's an atmospheric dissonance, not a narrative one, a small crack in the day's rhythm that throws everything out of sync. This paragraph holds deep metaphors about how humans relate to routine and trust their senses. We live so much of our lives by inference, relying on how the light changes, how our bodies respond to hunger, how windows flutter in familiar winds. And when one of those inferences fails us, say, the shadow isn't behaving correctly, our confidence in the moment crumbles quietly. Not catastrophically, but thoroughly enough that we stop mid-action. We wait, we question, we forget to eat. There's also something haunting about this moment. The uncertainty is not accompanied by a clear answer. No one explains why the shadows are wrong. No one rushes in to say it is evening or that something has broken the sky. The moment is suspended, unresolved, and that's what gives it its lingering power. On a symbolic level, this could represent any number of quiet societal breakdowns or internal emotional states. A community unsure how to proceed. A family experiencing a subtle grief that has no clear cause. A person stuck in time, emotionally or spiritually, while the world flutters just beyond reach. You could even read this passage as a kind of metaphor for loss of faith, not necessarily religious, but temporal. A loss of trust in the day, in one's own perception, in the ability of the world to behave as it always has. That kind of loss doesn't scream. It pauses. It makes people forget to eat. It makes shadows feel unfamiliar. Another beautiful element is the restraint of the language. Each sentence is clean, almost sparse. It doesn't dramatize the moment, it trusts the reader to feel the weight. That sparseness gives room for the atmosphere to bloom in the mind. It invites reflection, not reaction. That too is part of the magic. In a broader narrative, this passage could be a hinge point, a moment of subtle shift. Not a climax, not a revelation, but something in between. A breath held, a silence before motion resumes. And it works precisely because it never tells us what happened. It simply says, something didn't fit and people noticed. That alone is powerful. In essence, this passage is about the fragility of certainty. It speaks to how much we rely on things feeling right, even when we don't consciously think about them. And when they don't feel right, when a shadow stretches wrong, when the meal sits untouched, when the curtain flutters with no context, we are left unmoored, even in the quietest ways. This moment does not resolve, but maybe that's the point. Some dissonances aren't meant to be fixed, they're meant to be noticed and remembered, and held in the air like unanswered questions, the kind that linger longer than answers would. There is something quietly profound about the question a child asks in this scene. Is it still today? It's a question that shouldn't require much thought after all the passage of time. Is something we are taught to understand with clocks and calendars, by the movement of the sun across the sky and the changing light in the room. Yet here, in the simple exchange, the ordinary becomes slippery. A moment that might go unnoticed in most lives suddenly swells with meaning, because it points to something deeper, something most adults have long forgotten to question. How do we truly know what day it is when one blurs into another? The mother smiles, not in amusement, but in gentle resignation. Perhaps the smile is tired, stretched thin by the slow erosion of time's markers. It is a smile without confidence, without confirmation. She does not answer the child, not because she does not want to, but because she doesn't know how to. Her silence is not ignorance, but recognition. She, too, cannot tell if it is still today. This is not a moment about confusion in the face of a clock. It is about a world where the concept of today has lost its sharpness. Maybe the weather has been the same for too long. The clouds are moving in gray, blending one morning into the next. Or perhaps they live in a place or a state of mind where routine has overtaken variance. Days repeat themselves so precisely that nothing distinguishes one from the next. And in that repetition, A kind of temporal fog settles in. The body wakes, moves, eats, and rests. The world does not argue with this rhythm, but without change, even time forgets to announce itself. The child's question is instinctive. Children feel time differently, not measured in hours, but in events, surprises, and novelty. A day with nothing new is not easily held in memory. A child does not think of Tuesday as just another Tuesday. If the soup tastes the same, if the chores repeat, if the same chair squeaks in the same way, if no one visits, and nothing shifts, how can one be certain that this is a new day? How can you be sure it's not just the same day, stubbornly looping? And perhaps the mother once marked time this way too. Perhaps she used to track the days with things like market visits, or the number of candles burned through, or the letters that came and went. But now, those rhythms have stilled. She no longer counts the days to something. She no longer crosses them off. Time now flows like a slow river, and the banks that once marked its passage have eroded. There is no celebration coming, no end of week gathering, just quiet days stacked like papers with no titles. So she smiles and says nothing, because she cannot lie to the child, nor can she give truth. She is as unmoored in time as he is, though she carries it differently. For her, the blur is not a question, it is a condition. Maybe outside, the light is dull and unchanging. The sky might be the flat kind of gray that never commits to rain or clearing. Or perhaps the room they sit in has no windows at all, just soft ambient warmth and the low hum of ordinary life. In either case, the environment offers no clues. The clock on the wall might be working, but it only tells hours, not the feeling of the day. The calendar might still hang nearby, but its pages are untouched, its squares blank. It is not just the weather or the sameness of tasks. It is something deeper, a forgetting of purpose, of marking time for something, for someone. The days pass, but nothing waits at the end of them. There is no appointment on the horizon, no guest expected. The bread is made, the dish is cleaned, and the towels folded stand still. Nothing happens that insists today is different from yesterday. The child's question cuts to the heart of it. Is it still today? It is, perhaps, always today. If yesterday was indistinct and tomorrow offers no new shape, then today becomes both everything and nothing. It becomes a kind of holding space, a room without furniture. In that way, the moment becomes not one of despair, but of still time. There is no storm here, no tragedy, no panic, only the quiet, subtle unraveling of certainty. The child may have asked out of boredom or curiosity, or simply because he noticed the sameness, too. Children are far more observant than we credit them for. They see when adults sigh more often. They feel when footsteps slow. They notice when a home that once buzzed with activity now only whispers. The mother's smile is a kind of answer. It says, I hear you. I feel it too. It acknowledges something they both sense but cannot name. The smile holds the weight of 1,000 days spent gently, but without direction. And still, it is not a tragic smile. It is tender, accepting. Imagine the room they're in. Perhaps it's the same room every day, a kitchen with a worn table, a window smudged by time, and a kettle that hums at the same hour. There are footprints worn into the floorboards from habitual paths taken. A cat stretches in the corner, unconcerned. A fire flickers low, not needing to be fed just yet. Everything functions. Nothing breaks, but neither does anything truly change. This is a life without drama, but also without punctuation. They are not suffering, exactly. They are suspended. And that's what makes the child's question so poignant, because it reminds us that even in stillness, there is awareness, that even when nothing happens, we notice. The mother may one day tell him that it was always today in that house, that some places, some seasons of life refuse to move forward and instead fold time inward, that the value of a day isn't in what you do, but in what you notice. The hush of the walls, the slight shift of light on the floor, the way tea tastes slightly different when you forget the honey. That might be enough, or it might not be, but for now, she does not explain. She only smiles, because some questions are too big for answers and too small for explanations. They must be felt, And perhaps she hopes the child won't ask again. Or perhaps she hopes he always will, because someone needs to wonder about Tom. Someone needs to notice the soft, slow weathering of the days. And maybe, in another room, there's a journal open, half filled with entries about nothing in particular, or a calendar with only one day circled, or a drawer full of keys whose locks are long gone. These are the quiet markers of a time forgotten. But the child's voice, the question, becomes a new kind of bell. It rings softly, not to signal alarm, but to gently ask, "Are we still here? Are we still now?" And if she ever does answer, perhaps it will be in a whisper, "Yes, but I think we're drifting." Or maybe she'll simply say, "Let's call it today, just for now." There are moments in time that seem to stretch themselves beyond their boundaries, not because of any great noise or commotion, but because of an absence, a silence that feels like a question that has been asked and left unanswered. This is such a moment. The bell rang once. It was not part of a usual pattern, not part of the routine peal that announced the hour, the call to prayer, or the warning of fire or birth or death. It rang once, a solitary chime, then hesitated, as though caught mid-breath, as though it remembered something halfway through speaking, then stopped. It didn't ring again, and in that not ringing, everything shifted. People paused, whether they were in their gardens, or sweeping floors, or stirring soups, or dozing in chairs too well worn to replace when the bell rang. Their muscles paused just slightly. When it didn't ring again, the pause deepened. Not alarmed, don't panic, but the kind of silence that rests just beyond habit, where something is noticed, even if no one admits they noticed it. The bell was a known sound. It was stitched into the fabric of the town's rhythm. It belonged to morning and evening, to announcements and departures. Even if no one could recall the last time they truly listened to the bell, its absence now rang louder than any chime. Because that's what silence does, it holds echoes of the thing that isn't there. The second chime became more present through its not being than the first was in its ringing. Some looked toward the tower, shielding their eyes from the low sun. Others didn't bother. They waited to hear what followed, assuming that perhaps it had merely stumbled a gust of wind, a rope dropped, a hand slipping on old brass. But when no second chime came, they did not go up the hill to look, nor did they ask the bell ringer later that day. There was an unspoken agreement not to chase the silence. The bell had spoken in its own way, and that was enough. And yet, it lingered. This small disruption threaded itself into the town's routines. It curled itself around conversations that hesitated slightly longer, around cups that were held in hands a little too long before being set down. It wasn't dread. It wasn't even sadness. It was just an awareness, like the memory of a dream just out of reach, something that could have become more if only it had continued. But it didn't. What does it mean when a sound stops halfway through its meaning? Bells are meant to continue to chime in patterns, to close loops, to offer a full shape to the message they carry. A single bell toll, then silence, is unfinished music. It is the beginning of a sentence without the end. It is a footstep without the follow-through. A single sound, then the absence of sound, can feel more intimate, more vulnerable than a full ringing ever could. Some in the town remembered stories of bells that rang in odd times, omens, or mistakes, or signs of someone's return or someone's passing. But those were just stories, and no one felt compelled to revive them. Instead, they lived in the unconfirmed middle. They carried on with what they were doing, but not quite in the same way. The baker still kneaded his bread, but his hands slowed at the edges of the dough. The librarian still sorted returned scrolls and loose pages, but paused longer at the blank margins. Children still played near the pond, but their laughter was softened, as though even joy had muffled itself in respect. The bell's solitary sound, though brief, had left a mark not in what it said, but in what it didn't say next. No one could say why the bell didn't ring again. The rope was intact. The tower still stood. The air was calm. And yet, it didn't. Some suggested that perhaps the bell ringer had been distracted or interrupted. Some thought maybe the bell had stuck or cracked or slipped off its rhythm. But no one verified. Curiosity was overtaken by familiarity's inertia. It was easier to continue pretending the bell had never chimed at all than to seek an answer for why it stopped. That's the way many things settle in quiet places, not with dramatic closures, but with gradual acceptance. A door doesn't slam shut, it simply stops being opened. A tradition doesn't end, it just fades in priority until no one remembers to practice it. A second chime doesn't ring, and over time, the first one feels less urgent. But still, that moment the hesitation remained alive, if only in the background. The bell's single note became a symbol not of what had happened, but of what hadn't. It was the moment that promised more, but delivered less. That slight pause after the first sound was more evocative than any series of tones might have been. The bell, by ringing once and never again, had carved out a space for all the possible meanings that a second ring might have held. Was it a call unanswered? A warning cut short? A celebration that never began? Or was it something simpler, a bell, ringing for no reason, deciding not to repeat itself? Even in its silence, it had stirred awareness, and perhaps, unknowingly, that was its true purpose. The townspeople, in their quiet way, lived alongside that one chime. It became something like the breath before speech, a moment when anything might be said, but isn't. It became the lingering moment before dusk fully arrives, when shadows stretch but the day hasn't yet admitted night. That liminal quality that almost defined the days that followed. Someone, maybe a child, once asked aloud, why didn't it ring again? The adults didn't answer, not out of rudeness, but because they didn't know, and because they understood that not knowing might be more important than answering. The world is filled with questions that lose their weight when explained too cleanly. And so, the bell became a kind of shared mystery, one not spoken about, but felt. And in that way, it quietly shaped the lives of those around it. People became slightly more attentive to the in-between moments. They noticed the stillness between phrases. They waited a little longer before answering questions. They remembered what it was like to expect something and not receive it, and that expectation made them more gentle with each other. Eventually, the bell itself became less relevant. It remained in the tower, untouched. No one rang it. No one repaired or removed it. But its one last sound had become folded into memory, not like an event, but like weather, or the scent of a certain season. It wasn't history. It was the atmosphere. In years to come, no one would remember exactly when the bell rang the last time, but they would remember that at some point, there was a day the bell only rang once, and that from then on, something small but noticeable had changed. They wouldn't say it aloud. They wouldn't mark the day, but they would know. The silence that followed had become part of them. Even the tower itself seemed to acknowledge the change. It stood just as tall, but with a slightly different bearing, less a herald, more a witness. The stone looked the same, but light landed differently on its surface. Pigeons still nested there. Ivy still climbed its base, but the feeling of waiting, of expecting, never returned to the structure. It no longer invited attention. It merely remained. If someone new to town asked about the bell, they'd be met with a brief nod or a change in subject. Not because it was taboo, but because there wasn't much to say. It rang once, someone might eventually admit, and that was that. And in those words, a world of meaning lay just beneath the surface. The bell's final message was not in the sound it made, but in the absence it left. That single chime carved out a space for reflection, a moment in which everything became a little quieter, a little slower, a little more aware. It asked no questions, offered no clarity, and made no demands. And yet, its silence changed the tone of the world around it. That's the power of a single, incomplete gesture. It leaves space. It allows others to imagine, to interpret, and to project their own needs and emotions into it. The bell rang once. It hesitated. It didn't ring again. And because of that, it became unforgettable, not for what it said, but for what it allowed others to feel in the silence that followed. Time, as we commonly understand it, is measured in mechanical intervals. We rely on clocks, calendars, alarms, and schedules to define the shape of our days. These devices carve our lives into segments, morning routines, lunch breaks, commutes, and deadlines. In this line, though, there is a quiet revolution. Something happened day an unnamed event, perhaps subtle or perhaps profound, and from that moment onward, time no longer needed to be counted. People no longer reached for their watches or asked others for the hour. It wasn't that time stopped. It was that its meaning changed. And with that, the way people interacted with it changed too. This sentence suggests a transition from a rigid, external understanding of time to something internal and intuitive. Before, time was something people chased, measured, and feared missing. Afterward, it became something lived, felt, and understood innately. There's no mention of what caused the shift. It can have been grief. It can have been healing. It might have been a societal collapse, a return to simplicity, or simply a slow forgetting. Whatever the cause, its effect was quiet but transformative. People no longer needed to be told when to begin or end their days. They knew. They felt it. Time became a rhythm again instead of a command. This change in perception is not just philosophical, it's deeply human. Children, for example, do not measure time in minutes or hours. They live in moments. They play until they're tired. They eat when they're hungry. They nap when they're soothed. Their bodies guide them. Animals do the same. It is only adults, shaped by industrial expectations and societal structures, who feel the need to divide time into usable portions. We are trained to fit into hours and be productive within them. But in this new world hinted by the sentence, the kind of measurement has lost its place. To stop asking the hour is to stop outsourcing your internal sense of rhythm. Imagine a village where no bell tolls, no school buzzer sounds, and no shift horn blares. Yet the bread still rises, the fields still get tended, and people still gather to rest at dusk. It's not disorder, it's return. A return to feeling rather than calculating. There's a kind of peace implied in this shift. It's not urgency that guides people, but presence. They are no longer ruled by schedules, but by a subtler kind of knowing. This could also be a metaphor for grief or healing. After a loss, time warps. People often say that hours stretch while days disappear. In the wake of mourning, the question, what time is it, becomes meaningless. The sun moves, the light fades, and the shadows stretch, but your inner world is still. After such an experience, people may never return fully to their old ways of measuring life. They may begin instead to move when they feel ready, to rest when the ache returns, and to begin again without a signal but with a sense. The phrase "and then time continued," but not in the same way, marks a pivot point. Something ended. Perhaps it was the end of certainty, or maybe it was the end of a collective agreement to live life by the clock. Either way, something was no longer needed, and in that absence, something else emerged. A new understanding of time, one that doesn't require numbers, one that relies on instinct, patience, and attention. It's the kind of time kept by trees, rivers, and those who no longer hurry. Consider what happens to a community when it no longer tells time, but feels it. Meals are made when the garden is ready, not when the clock says noon. Children are called home when the shadows grow long, not when the bell rings. People stop working not because the hour is late, but because their bodies tire. There is a slowness in this rhythm, not laziness, but intentionality, a pace that listens rather than dictates. And this isn't just romantic idealism. Indigenous cultures, small farming villages, and some spiritual communities have long lived this way. Time, to them, is not something you conquer, but something you honor. You rise with the sun. You rest with the moon. The seasons dictate what is possible and what is not. Time is not something you check, it is something you trust. You don't need to ask the hour because you already know what it feels like. This change, then, is not about losing time, it is about reclaiming it. Reclaiming it from machines, from institutions, from expectations that divide the day into pieces that serve industry more than humanity. When people stop asking the hour, they may not be lost. They may be found. They may be returning to a state of attunement, where their actions emerge not from pressure, but from presence. It's also possible that this sentence describes a kind of recovery. Imagine a world after noise, after busyness, after trauma. Maybe it was war. Maybe it was isolation. Maybe it was silence so deep that people had to relearn how to live in it. And once they did, they discovered they didn't need all the signals they once relied on. They didn't need the office chime, the train whistle, or the school bell. Their own inner sense, long buried, began to whisper again, and they listened. In this world, life is still structured, but the structure is lived, not imposed. There's a softness to it. People aren't rushing. They're moving in response to what's around them. They might still work hard, but they rest hard too. The boundaries of time haven't disappeared, they've just been absorbed, internalized, made gentle, and then time continued, but not in the same way. The phrase feels like a turning point in a larger narrative. Not the end, not the climax, but the place where something shifted. A story in which the beginning was loud, urgent, and full of clocks, and then something changed. Not all at once. Maybe at first it was one person who stopped setting alarms. Another who let the bread rise by feel, not by timer. Another who stopped checking their watch during a conversation. And slowly, it spread, until eventually, people stopped asking the hour. Because they didn't need to anymore. And there's something tender about that. It's not a dystopia. It's not a collapse. It's a soft turning towards something more human. People still live their lives. They still move through mornings and evenings. But they do so with attention instead of obligation. They look to the sky. They look to each other. They look inward. And they know. That knowledge is not magical. It's not mystical. It's deeply ordinary. It's the kind of knowing we all have when we step away from screens and schedules. When we take a walk without checking the time. When we sit in the sun and notice how its warmth changes as it drifts west. When we listen to our breath and realize it has its own rhythm, its own sense of when to quicken and when to slow. That's the kind of time this sentence speaks of. It might also speak to the endurance of life. That no matter what happens, loss, disaster, forgetting time keeps moving. But the way we relate to it is up to us. We can live by the hour, or we can live by the moment. We can ask what time it is, or we can feel when it's time to begin again. This line resists finality. It doesn't say time changed. It says time continued. But it qualifies the continuation. It was not in the same way. That's where the quiet power lies. The world didn't stop turning. People didn't vanish. Life didn't cease. It just softened, shifted, found a new path. And in that new path, people stopped asking the hour. Not because they didn't care, but because they remembered how to know when to wait, when to gather, when to grieve, when to laugh, when to begin again.